The glass walls of the lab should have shattered when the engine screamed, but they bent instead, curving like hot sugar around the humming core. Lex Luthor stood inside the circle of light with his palms open, reading the numbers sliding down his visor. He had called it a resonance engine because "door to elsewhere" sounded like a sermon. The coils hit alignment. Space flexed. The room breathed in. "Begin capture," he said. The machine obeyed. The world did not. Every line on the floor stretched thin as wire and then snapped back with a crack that wasn't sound at all. He felt the clean, burning taste of ozone and the bitter of copper on his tongue. For half a heartbeat he saw Metropolis reflected on itself. 6 Lexes, one in each pane of glass, all nodding. Then the light folded like a fist. He fell through the gap. He didn't scream. The immaterium swallowed him as a choir of voices tried on his name like a new coat. He saw impossible architecture drifting on tides of thought, cathedrals, flowers, bones, planets. Then everything peeled away and left him with gravity, heat, and the stink of oil. He slammed into corrugated metal and rolled, armoring plates taking the worst of it while his lungs tried to separate from his ribs. He lifted his head. The sky was a bruise. Towers like knives stabbed up from a horizon of broken chimneys. He recognized nothing and almost smiled. New board. New game. Footfalls scraped. Red optics winked in a haze of dust. Figures rose from the wreckage around him. Gaunt men sheathed in flaking metal, cables drilled into their skulls. Their rifles spoke machine prayers between clicks. Identify, one intoned in a voice half human, half radio. Lex pushed himself to a knee and let his suit systems bloom. Environment scan, chemical smell of the air, gravity 0.98, particulate density off any chart Metropolis ever printed. The nearest figure's weapon hummed with charge. He could fight. He could also win something more useful than a corpse. Visitor, Lex said. Unscheduled. They didn't appreciate the joke. The leader gestured, and 2 figures moved to flank him with harsh economy. He saw the math of their approach, subroutines honed into religion. Ritual, not curiosity. Good. Predictable. Lex flicked his wrists. 2 microdrones unspooled from compartments in his forearms and licked the floor with lasers, mapping magnetic density. The debris field was iron-rich. Their boots were magnetized. He pulsed a frequency. The men froze in their own shoes, not by magic but by a viciously simple principle. Careful, Lex said, rising. You'll wrench a knee. The leader tore free with a grunt and fired. The bolt cracked air and ate a hole through a bent girder behind Lex. In response, the armor around Lex's chest woke like a sleeping animal. Hex plates overlapped, energy core pulsed. He did not return fire. He simply walked forward, and the men hesitated because a creature that advances into gunfire is either divine or insane. They chose the third option. They called for more. Floodlights ignited. A metal barge hung about 30 meters above the wreck, swaying on grav plates. The symbol stamped into its hull was a skull turning into a cog. A drop ramp yawned, and black-cloaked figures peered down from within an iron chapel built onto the ship's spine. Candles guttered behind them. Candles on a shuttle. Incense spilled into the night. Lex lifted his hands again, palms open. "Take me to your engineer," he said. They shackled him with chains that smelled of sanctified oil. They marched him past a line of men wearing flak jackets and rusted devotion. The barge stank like prayer and ozone. He learned swiftly. Recitations were passwords, knocks were prayers, switches were sacraments. He did not sneer. He memorized. The barge knifed through a canyon of broken spires and out onto a plain where a city rose like a fossilized storm. Structures braided around each other, cathedral and factory in a single heaving organism. 100,000 stained glass windows eyeless with soot. It was a hive, he decided, in both the entomological and political sense. Its name arrived in a stanza of static from a Vox set bolted to the bulkhead. Kespera. When they pushed him to the deck, the sky was the color of old parchment lit from behind by a sick sun. Bells tolled at random, as if the wind had found the ropes. He tasted ash and something else. Salt, maybe, and old smoke. The city exhaled heat through vents like dragon mouths. And everywhere, icons. Wings, skulls, two-headed eagles that declared unity with an edge of threat. They walked him beneath arches so large they could have hosted zeppelins, through gates lined with flayed metal banners, down into a cathedral whose bones were cranes and whose stained glass depicted war as a sacrament. Servitor cherubs hovered overhead, nude porcelain dolls with buzzsaw mouths, carrying scrolls written in copper wire. A woman waited in the nave. Her black coat cut the light like a blade. A sigil, a stylized eye, hung at her throat on iron chain. Inquisitor Seraphine Drax, one of the armored escorts, whispered as if naming a storm. She looked Lex over with a surgeon's impatience. He looked back as a peer would. The guards shoved him to his knees. He took the impact and smiled up from it. "You arrive in the wake of a mechanized prayer," she said. "You are not of any sanctioned world, city, regiment, cult, or manufactorum. Your armor is unknown. Your words have a wrong taste. Describe your origin before I cleanse you of it." "Metropolis," Lex said. "A city that prefers glass to iron and sun to smoke." Her gaze barely changed. "Metaphor is corruption." "Then file me under corruption. But before you do, let me tidy a few inefficiencies in your machine." She should have struck him. Instead, she gestured toward a brass engine squatting in the nave, cables like veins running into the walls. The device was a lie box, a lie eater, something meant to translate sweat and pulse into truth. Its needles trembled in incense-thick air. Lex watched the frequency drift with each hymn note sung by the small choir in the side chapel. Measurement contaminated by liturgy. He laughed under his breath and she heard it. "Amuse me," Drax said. Lex tipped a finger against his shackles. They hissed. His suit had mapped their simple locking algorithm. It owed the design to fear, not ingenuity. He stood before the device as if approaching a poorly written equation. "You drape your machine in iconography to make it obedient to your culture," he said, opening a panel with one corner of a gauntlet. "Fine. But the choir's breath changes humidity by 2% every choral pause, which drifts your needle by 5. Your truth reduces to mood." A guard raised a weapon. Drax held up a hand. "How would you correct it?" she asked. "Separate your religion from your measurement," Lex said. "But given your brand constraints, I'll do you one better." He snapped a wire from the servitor cherub drifting above, hit the panel again, and fed the signal through a stabilizing loop printed in his palm weeks ago for a different problem. The needle steadied like a horse meeting a firm hand. The choir sang louder. The needle did not care. The guards shifted. The Inquisitor's mouth flattened into the suggestion of approval. "Accurate machines serve the Emperor," she said. "Accurate machines serve the problem," Lex answered. "What is yours?" "Warp storms choke our lanes. Manufactories fall to possession and mad fire. The people pray louder and starve by the same measure. You will fix it, or you will burn while I watch." "Motivating," Lex said. Behind his calm, something hungry stirred. A world of bad math waited to be corrected. He bowed only with his head, a nod given to a partner he would one day outmaneuver. "Show me your broken hinge." They marched him a second time, but now the route bent toward work. They led him through a corridor of statues so eroded they had become generalities. Warrior, mother, saint, machine. They crossed a bridge where men below fought rats the size of dogs, and women cupped soot from rooftop condensers into tin bowls. Spire bells kept time like a failing heart. They brought him to the manufactorum at the city's edge, a cathedral of cranes and roaring funnels. The air shimmered with heat. The overseer, a man fused to his console by a tangle of fiber and scar, rattled off figures. Output down. Workers missing. Machines speaking in dreams. Lex tasted the numbers and found them rancid. "Seal the chant ducks," he said. "The what?" The overseer croaked. "Those brass vents piping the hymns onto the floor," Lex said. "You're aerosolizing devotion and fatigue. It makes people sloppy. And it partially resonates with your coil timing, which is how you've let the other ecosystem sniff you." They didn't move. He didn't ask again. He vaulted onto a railing, tore open a vent, and jammed a small hex plate from his suit into the mouth. When the next choir note came, the plate drank it and purred. The floor shook. A seam of air split like an eyelid opening. Heat bled into a color that wasn't color. Things crawled out, slick with thought. Men screamed. Lex saw the shape of it. The manufactorum's thermal cycle, the hymn's cadence, human fear. 3 points of a triangle making a door. He didn't hesitate. He stripped 2 more plates and slapped them onto promethium tanks, then keyed a frequency that should not have existed in this world. Hex patterns crawled over metal, found each other, clicked. A green wave rolled, soft as a sigh. The things from the seam shivered as if remembering another rule and broke into flakes that the heat ate. The wave fell. The seam sealed. The men on the gantries stared at him the way people stare at a cliff that did not fall when it should have. Lex kept one hand on the last plate, feeling the hum through his palm, eyes closed for just a heartbeat, drunk on the clarity of good engineering. When he opened them, a giant in blue armor stood before him like a monument that had learned to walk. The warrior's lenses burned crimson. His weapon looked like a cathedral made a gun. "Brother Captain Marius Valen," said a vox voice from the giant's collar. "You deploy heretical artifacts in sacred industry." Lex shook burning residue from his gauntlets and met the lenses without blinking. "I deploy solutions. Your floor is no longer a mouth for nightmares. You're welcome." The giant's finger rested against the trigger housing. After a long moment, he lowered it. "Inquisitor." Drax had watched the entire sequence from the catwalk, coat dark against a weld flare sky. She looked down at Lex like a chess player reconsidering the board. "He lives," she said. "For now." Then, to Lex, "You will tell me every principle behind what you did. You will improve output by 15%. You will not speak to the workers except to direct them. And you will never pray." "I've never been good at pretending," Lex said. "Then you'll fit," she answered bleakly. They left the manufactorum by a different route, across a walkway where the heat thinned, through a courtyard where a fountain spat steam. People pressed to see him. Soot-faced men, women with cables bead-braided in their hair, children in rags that had once been uniforms. Someone whispered, just loud enough for rumor to catch, that the man in green had quieted the fire without a hymn. The whisper ran ahead like a spark on dry tinder. Lex pretended not to hear. He cataloged the city as a system. Inputs, outputs, losses to superstition, losses to fear, losses to cruelty. He could fix it. He could fix so much. He felt that dangerous lightness in his chest again, the one that usually arrived before a new empire. At the cathedral steps, Drax stopped. Valen loomed behind her like a walking verdict. Far above, cherubs circled with scrolls that skittered in the wind. "You are a problem in a human shape," Drax said. "I will use you until you break, and then I will end you. If you believe otherwise, perhaps your gods are kinder than ours." "I don't have gods," Lex said. "I have results." She considered that, a slow fall of lashes and a thinner line to her mouth. Valen's lenses never left Lex's face. The city groaned around them. Metal settling, prayers rising, pistons knocking. "Tomorrow," Drax said, turning away, "we teach you our star charts. Then we try not to drown in them." Lex watched her go and let his grin show at last, pale and sharp. The hive city of Kespera sprawled before him in tiers of smoke and faded saints, so vast it almost pretended to eternity. He flexed his hands. The armor whispered. Somewhere above the clouds, a network of lights kept ships from dying between stars. Somewhere below, the poor boiled rain for soup. He stood exactly in the seam. A new board. A new game. And the same simple rule: make the world make sense or make it kneel. The morning came without a sunrise. The smog above Kespera only grew paler until the city's cathedrals appeared through it like bones surfacing in shallow water. Lex Luthor stood on a platform overlooking the lower manufactoria, his armor systems recharging from the previous night's chaos. The air trembled with the rhythm of machines that sounded more like organs than engines. Down below, men in ash-stained robes hammered metal while chanting lines from a prayer Lex had already learned to ignore. Inquisitor Seraphine Drax waited behind him, her coat swaying in the hot updrafts. "You sleep?" she asked. "I optimize," Lex said, eyes still on the skyline. Sleep is a luxury for species with nothing to prove. Then consider yourself human again, she replied. We have work that needs more than your arrogance. She tossed him a data slate. The text glowed in the local dialect, a mixture of binary script and Latin too corrupted for any scholar on Earth to read. The information was raw, charts of void storms surrounding the sector, planetary communication failures, strange signal distortions. Lex scrolled through it, translating patterns faster than her words could fill the silence. The warp storms follow no stable cycle, Drax said, walking closer. Our navigators are blind beyond this system. Supply fleets vanish. Entire colonies drift. The Emperor's light still shines, but faintly. Lex frowned, fingers sliding across the holographic graph. You're describing quantum phase turbulence caused by external psychic pressure. You think it's divine interference. I think it's bad engineering. Valen's metallic footsteps echoed as he approached, his armored bulk blocking half the light from the chamber's stained windows. Mind your tongue, off-worlder. The Emperor's light guides every soul who dares the void. Lex turned his head slightly, unafraid. Then perhaps your god should install better shielding. The Marine's fists clenched, metal whining. Drax raised a hand again, tired but firm. Enough. He is a weapon captain, not a preacher. Let him think in numbers if it keeps the storms quiet. She led them both to the center of the hall, where a vast globe of the sector hung suspended in magnetic rings. Its surface shimmered with star systems flickering in and out like dying candles. Drax pointed toward a cluster near the outer rim. There, she said. The forge moon of Xenthos. Its transmissions ceased 3 months ago. It produced plasma conduits vital for our fleets. We sent 3 patrols. None returned. Only static. And you want me to fix your moon, Lex said. I want you to find out what silenced it, she corrected. And if you can, wake it. Valen stepped forward, helmet lenses glowing crimson. You will not go alone. I and my strike team will accompany you. The Inquisition does not grant trust. It earns proof. Fair enough, Lex said. Just stay out of my calculations. Hours later, the dropship roared through the upper haze, cutting across the bruised clouds that shrouded Kespera. Lex sat opposite Valen and his Marines, each encased in armor the size of a coffin, each silent as a tomb. Drax's voice crackled through Vox comms. You'll find the moon cold and broken. Remember, heresy takes many forms. If it whispers, kill it. The shuttle bucked as it entered orbit. Through the narrow viewport, Lex saw Xenthos, an orb of ash and rust, ringed by debris that shimmered faintly with energy discharge. The surface flickered with the dying heartbeat of old reactors. The ship touched down on a landing pad half buried in dust. The air was metallic and dry. The Marines formed a perimeter while Lex stepped onto the ground. His boots sank slightly into the powder. Static danced over his armor. He crouched, scooping a handful of the dust into his glove. Iron oxide, radiation residue, and resonance fragments, he murmured. Your moon's been singing to the warp. Valen's voice came through the comms, distorted by interference. Then silence it. They advanced through the ruins. Massive foundries filled with half-melted machinery, rusted cranes, and statues of the Omnicia, their faces worn smooth. The deeper they moved, the louder a faint, rhythmic vibration became. It wasn't sound, exactly. It pressed against the skull like a pulse of thought. The Marine's armor runes flickered. Lex followed it to a pit at the foundry's core. Inside, a reactor pulsed with sickly green light. The energy fields twisted in patterns that made no sense. Mathematical impossibilities scribbled across physics itself. This is not entropy, Lex whispered. It's intention. He moved toward the reactor. The air thickened as though resisting him. He reached out a hand, letting his suit analyze the frequencies. A whisper brushed his thoughts. Not words, concepts. Promises of endless data, endless understanding, endless dominion. He smiled. Flattery from a hallucination. How quaint. He activated his gauntlet. A network of energy filaments lashed out, embedding into the reactor's frame. The whisper turned into a shriek that rattled the air. The Marines raised their weapons, firing into the light. Bolter shells exploded like thunder. Lex ignored them. His mind raced through equations faster than terror could form. He adjusted frequencies, realigned resonance, and forced the energy to collapse inward. With a sound like the sky itself exhaling, the light vanished. The room plunged into darkness. When the emergency glow returned, the reactor was silent. The walls were cracked but stable. The air felt lighter, as if the world had unclenched a fist. Valen approached, steam rising from his armor vents. "What did you do?" "I removed the parasite in your power grid," Lex said calmly. "A warp echo feeding on repetition. You kept praying to your machines, and the echo mistook it for worship." "You mock our faith," Valen said. "I'm educating your faith," Lex replied. "There's a difference." They exited the foundry in silence. Outside, the static clouds had thinned. Stars shimmered faintly through the gloom. Lex stood for a long moment, watching the distant horizon where the void met the black sky. Drax's voice came again through the comms. "Report." "The moon is functional," Valen said. "The corruption purged." "Define corruption," Drax demanded. Lex took the comm. "You can call it demonic, spiritual, metaphysical. Pick your vocabulary. The real issue was feedback between belief and system resonance. Your people built technology that listens to prayer. I stopped it from answering." Silence, then Drax's dry voice. "You're walking a very thin line, Luthor." "I've made a career of it," he replied, looking out at the stars. "And I always balance." When they returned to Kespera, the people already whispered. Word spread faster than the ships could fly. The stranger in green had tamed a cursed moon. Priests muttered in fear. Engineers hid curiosity behind ritual. And somewhere deep beneath the city, in data coffins and archives sealed by 10,000 years of superstition, Lex's actions lit up like a beacon, one that drew attention. Not all attention was human. As Lex walked through the hangar, Drax met him at the ramp, hands clasped behind her back. "You've stirred something," she said quietly. "Progress," he said. "Doubt," she corrected. "And doubt can rot faster than faith." He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it's time your faith evolved." She looked at him long enough for silence to stretch into warning. "Be careful what you teach this world, Luthor. It remembers heretics for millennia." "I don't plan to be remembered," he said, stepping past her into the flickering light. "I plan to be necessary." Above them, lightning stitched the sky, tracing symbols no human had written. Something vast had noticed the logic now crawling inside the Imperium's veins. And Lex, unaware of the shadows stretching toward him, walked deeper into the machine of faith he intended to redesign. Rain came down like filings, black and glittering, carried on a wind that tasted of burnt copper. Lex stepped out into it with a hooded cloak thrown over the emerald geometry of his suit. The city breathed through a million vents and chimneys. Every exhale was a hymn and a cough. He'd asked for a workspace and they had given him a reliquary. A chamber once devoted to the bones of a saint engineer, now cleared of candles and relics and filled with the equipment he demanded. The walls still wore soot silhouettes where icons had hung for 100 years. A figure waited inside already, cloaked in red, cowl bristling with jointed arms and cog-toothed relics. Cables ran from the figure's spine into a backpack shrine of brass and bone. Lenses clicked softly as they focused on Lex. Mugos Dominus Calix, the voice rasped through vox and throat at once, every syllable a compromise between flesh and machine. "We were instructed to provide cooperation." "You were also curious," Lex said, peeling back the cloak. "I can smell it through the incense." A servo skull bobbed overhead, candlelight trembling on the wax pooled around its iron nails. Calix's lenses tracked it back to Lex. A sliver of a smile, more adjustment of posture than expression, moved his mouth. "Your stabilizer plate ignored coral humidity," Calix said, gesturing to a schematic slate. "Such blasphemy should not have functioned." "It did." "It did because blasphemy is a word you learned to avoid the work you wanted," Lex said. He tapped the slate and the model unfolded, wireframe and clear. Your city's utilities are a knot of ritual and rust. Untie the knot and you stop wasting lives. Here's what we'll do. He laid out the triad like an engineer composing a prayer he could tolerate. Energy you can trust, water that does not poison its children, sanitation that does not breed plagues with names hushed in alleys. He replaced dozens of sainted but dying plasma cores with modular microfusion spires whose outputs didn't swing with choir attendance. He tapped runoff veins under the cathedral terraces and built filtration towers out of condemned sensor stacks. He drew latrine heat into compact digesters to feed the grid. Calyx watched, the red-robed fingers of his mechadendrites flexing unconsciously in time with Lex's planning, as if grasping tools that hadn't been sanctified yet. This violates the liturgy of 18 orders, Calyx whispered, which was another way of saying the plan would work and he knew it. Then we teach the liturgy a more accurate rhythm, Lex said. Start with a spire here, here, and here. And I'll need open access to the East Aqueduct. You will be flayed by the ecclesiarchy, Calyx said almost thoughtfully. Not if the lights come on when the bells ring, Lex answered. People forgive heresy when it boils water. Work began before the ink of permission could dry. It spread like rumor through the underhive. Teams with strange tools and new protocols, priests forced to sign off on diagrams that read like greedless miracles. Lex wore his armor openly now. When he walked the narrow bridges between hab blocks, he became a moving argument in green and purple, a promise with steps. Children stared, then smiled because all promises are beautiful before they're tested. Valen supervised any place the plan brushed a barracks or armory. He did not approve. He stood on gantries with bolter across his chest and watched the hex spires rise, watched water clear, watched plumbers become acolytes of a different scripture. He said little. His silence was a weight, but not an obstruction. Drax watched differently. She appeared in doorways at odd hours, in the echo between a drill scream and a priest's recitation. She spoke with the people, then with Lex, then with people again, making the city tell her the truth of itself. When her gaze fell on Lex, it was a ledger closing. When it lifted, it was a sentence not yet spoken. By the week's end, the first spire woke. It was not a miracle. It was a column of layered plates and coiled geometry, humming with a note that felt like standing beside a deep river. The lamps across 5 districts rose from their cough fever flicker into a steady glow. The hiss of boilers evened. For the first time anyone could remember, the water that came from the taps tasted like nothing at all. At evening, men and women gathered under the spire and did not pray. They just stood, hands held out to feel the heat rise gentle against their palms. Someone began to sing anyway, and the song had no saints in it, only the names of streets and children and tools. Lex stayed back in the shadows of a strut, unreadable. Calyx stood beside him, lenses reflecting 1,000 faces as if a machine had learned to be moved. You will make enemies faster than you make power, Calyx said. I have always been excellent at both, Lex replied. The enemies arrived in whispers and then in robes. The ecclesiarchal delegates came with candles and censers and knives hidden where only a heretic would notice. They demanded explanations, then demanded offerings to the proper saints, then demanded the dismantling of the spires to rebuild them with the correct prayers etched into their ribs. Lex declined in language so polite it burned. Drax interposed herself like a legal writ made flesh and ice. Her words made a scaffold that Lex could climb while the priests fumed. That night, someone painted a symbol, skull and sunburst, on the spire's access hatch, then smeared it into a threat. In the morning, it was washed clean by a woman with pump-calloused hands before Lex even saw it. He watched her finish and she met his gaze with a chin lifted from years of work. Light's good, she said simply. Don't care what name it's under. Keep saying that, Lex said. Out loud. A shiver passed through the city that had nothing to do with weather. In the cathedral's deep places, Astropath Isola pressed her palms to the cool stone and whispered numbers that weren't numbers. She saw Lex as a cold star cutting a black wake through the warp, and the warp hissed around him like a wounded thing. She told Drax without words, and Drax stood on a balcony and watched the spire lights draw moths with minds. The second spire woke, then the third. The underhive's stink softened. Fewer children coughed themselves sleep. The Manufactoria's error margins narrowed. With every improvement, Lex's smile grew thinner, not wider. Each solved piece revealed a larger, uglier puzzle. He began to sketch innovations for transit, for food, for medical protocols the city did not possess and could not imagine wanting. He wrote them as notes to himself but left them where the right eyes might find them. Calix found them. Calix's hands shook, wires twitching, over diagrams that would have been blasphemy yesterday but looked like survival today. The counterstroke came close to midnight, rising like bad breath from a grate. Alarms began as sanctified chimes and became screams. Valen's voice thundered through Vox, ordering citizens to their habs. Drax was already moving before the first bell finished its cough. Lex saw the pattern of the panic before he saw its cause. 5 power nodes dropped simultaneously, and the 6th spiked into a frequency he recognized from Zenthos. Someone had taught the city to pray wrong on purpose. He moved. Calix was with him, mechadendrites snapping into faster and uglier tools. They reached the substation in time to smell the iron-sweet bite of fresh blood. The door had been opened with a key made of fear. Inside, servitors lay dismantled like blasphemous angels. Halos of their optics scattered across the floor. Cables had been braided into a sigil that pulsed with a heartbeat you couldn't hear with ears. Hertech, Calix hissed, the word full of both hunger and hate. Rational sabotage, Lex corrected. Even as his own skin felt the wrongness in the air. He tore the sigil apart without touching it. New plates hissing from his gauntlets to lock onto anchor points he'd insisted be installed when the spires went up. He rerouted power through a path he'd designed and never published. The substation stopped feeling like a chapel and remembered it was a machine. The wall tore. Not with force, but with decision. A man stepped through the dust, a silhouette stitched from scrap and brilliance. His armor had been a tech priest once and perhaps a half-dozen other lives besides. It wore cables like line scars and ash like pride. His face was mostly human, which made what remained of it worse. Arch-Hertech Vorn Hale, Calix breathed. The way he said the name was not reverence or revulsion, but the small bow some men make before a rival they must kill to see what they themselves are. The newcomer ignored Calix. His gaze measured Lex the way a knife measures a throat. The city has grown a new algorithm, he said, voice dry as rust. One that edits saints. Just good arithmetic, Lex said. Hale smiled with the ruined side of his mouth. Arithmetic becomes theology when it decides how people live. You're building a cathedral of numbers. I approve of the method, not the master. Bolter fire crashed through the room from the doorway as Valen's squad slammed into the space. Hale moved like a thought. Fast, precise. He threw a sphere that burst into a cloud of particles, bolter shells chewing the cloud instead of the man. Calix lunged with a cutting torch. Hale parried with a blade that hummed wrong, edged in algorithms, and sparks cascaded like fallen stars. Lex didn't draw a weapon. He used the room. He had mapped every magnetic coupling in the casing, every ferrous line in the floor, every anchor he had demanded. He pulsed the field in a pattern no one had ever blessed and threw everything not bolted down into the center of the space. Hale stumbled as tools and plates and pieces of his own assembly screamed toward him. He planted a spike and the field hiccuped. Beautiful, Hale said. You think like a traitor to one god, which is to say a priest of another. I don't need gods, Lex said, advancing through the hail, gauntlet plates unfolding to make a bridged shield. I need functional infrastructure. Hale laughed, bitter and delighted at once. We agree more than our friends would like. And that is why we must kill each other. They hit. Lex's shield met Hale's blade. Green light running teeth first into distortion. Calix struck from the flank. Valen entered like a battering ram, shouldering aside physics with ceramite and will. Hale flowed backward, darted forward, sketched sigils in empty air that wanted to be doors. Lex tuned the room tighter. The air groaned. The would-be doors forgot themselves. Hale's eyes flashed with amusement and something like respect. You're not from here, he said over the grind and spark. That makes you honest. You're not staying here, Lex answered and drove him toward the coil. The magnetics snapped again, now with a frequency he had stolen from the warp without telling it. Hale stumbled. Valen's fist met his chest with the sound of a bell being rung too hard. The arch-heretic reeled, coughed blood that steamed on the cold floor, and flung a last blade. It kissed Calix's side, taking a ribbon of robe and a spray of sparks. Hale vanished in his own smoke, body dropping through a hatch that should have been welded shut. He left a gift, a timed cascade in the substation's logic, ticks aligned with the prayer bells. Lex broke it before the first bell had the chance to toll, fingers moving in a blur that made the machine forget the lie it had just learned. Silence slammed down. The emergency lights steadied. The spires hummed. Somewhere in the city, a baby that had never known dark quieted without knowing why. Calix braced himself on a console, curses made of machine code flickering out between teeth. Valen stood over the hatch, red lenses glowing like small suns. "Finish your cuts," Drax said from the doorway, voice too calm. She had arrived without a sound, pistol lowered, gaze taking in the wreckage and the bent pieces of a night that had almost become a legend the wrong way. "And then sleep, all of you, before you stagger into another disaster. We will hunt Hale. And we will tighten your algorithm cathedral until heresy can't breathe inside it." Lex turned to her. "Heresy is just a label for ideas that arrived early. And graves are a label for men who confuse the two," she said. "There will be no speeches tonight, Luthor. Only repairs." They made them. Dawn came like a bruise yellowing. The spires still sang. The underhive still breathed. Word spread too fast for any official to catch up with it. A fight in the dark, a saboteur who knew the catechisms of machines, a green stranger who bent a room to his will until it decided to be safe. By noon, women in market alleys were repeating a new joke about saints who arrived late to their own miracles. Lex heard it as he walked a catwalk high above the city, the rain now only damp ash. He stopped and watched the tears of Kespera from a height that made it look almost rational. Somewhere, Astropath Isola whispered his cold star name to walls that had learned to listen. Somewhere else, Vorn Hale considered a blade and a new plan. And beside Lex, the empty air carried a smell like metal before lightning. He breathed in. The board had changed again. He would have to play faster. Night slid over Kespera like a lid, and the hive lights stayed up instead of guttering one by one into fear. On a mezzanine above the reliquary workshop, Calix lay half-propped among metal cushions while a med-servitor stitched his side with neat loops of wire and prayer. The wound smoked faintly. His mechadendrites twitched in irritation and kept accidentally passing him tools as if pain were a fabrication error he could fix. "You should rest," Lex said, scanning a cluster of schematics suspended in pale green. "I need your brain uncorrupted by heroics." Calix's laugh rattled like loose bolts. "We maintain. The flesh is the part that protests change." "Then ignore the parts that don't contribute," Lex murmured. His gauntlet flashed. The schematics condensed into a single lattice. Power, water, waste, transit, then unfurled again with new notes threaded through, thin as veins. "Calix, how long to splice a clean line to the North Vox Tower?" "A day with cooperation," Calix said. 3 without. 5 with the ecclesiarchy watching. "Do it in 2. Quietly. I need a microphone the whole city hears." Valen stood at the doorway, helmet off, the harsh planes of his face carved by years and discipline. Without the lenses, his eyes were simply human. Tired, wary, curious against orders. He watched the lattice spin. "You intend to speak to the hive," he said. "I intend to give it instructions," Lex replied. "The kind that do not require belief to function." "That is not how Kespera breathes," Valen said. "Then I'll change its respiration." Lex flicked another series of models into place. Small, testable, undeniably useful. Clear lung masks cheap enough to print from scrap. A food paste that didn't taste like rust and ash. A safety protocol for boiler valves that would save fingers and lives. I give results. People can like me later. Valen's gaze slid to Calix's dressings and back. Hale will strike again. "Good," Lex said. "Competition sharpens design." Dawn did not break so much as lighten the bruise. Workers drifted toward shifts, children toward the corners where bread sometimes appeared, Priests toward pulpits where warnings waited. In the shadow of the North Vox Tower, Calix's crew in red robes muttered pieties over panels while their hands performed far more efficient sacrilege. Lex watched the tower groan awake, gears coughing dust, servitors lubed with incense, then palmed a plate against the base and taught the old lungs a new rhythm. When the tower took the beat, the hive seemed to lean in. The broadcast lens had a crack through it that made Lex's reflection into two men spliced at the cheekbone. He angled it, engaged the dampeners he and Calix had whispered into existence, and let the city fall into his visor. Faces stacked in tiers, eyes lifted. Rooms where families held their breath. Alleys where gangs paused in the middle of deciding who bled. A chapel where a priest froze with his mouth open and the first syllable of a warning stranded on his tongue. People of Kespera, Lex said, and his voice traveled like a clean blade. No saints. No thunder. No rhetoric thick with incense. He spoke like a foreman on a deadline, like a surgeon during triage. Your city is a machine made of you. It can be tuned. It can be fair. It can be survivable. I will build 3 things and keep 3 promises. Light that does not flicker. Water that does not sicken. Work that does not maim for no gain. A child in the underhive reached up toward the sound with a hand tattooed for luck and found it unnecessary while the voice lasted. In return, Lex went on, you will keep 3 standards. Clean the intakes. Report faults without fear. Learn 1 skill, then 2, then enough to teach the next person. No saints will save you. Only standards. We will measure, and when we fail the measure, we fix the thing that failed. The words were betrayal dressed as comfort. They were also a ladder. He did not ask for worship. He assigned tasks. He named streets and drains and specific boilers by their cogitator numbers, so no one could pretend the speech was about anything but work. He closed with a schedule. The spire lights will falter for 3 breaths at the 6th bell tonight as we reroute. Do not panic. If your water runs brown, let it until the 3rd cough, then run it clear. If you are going to stab someone over bread, wait until tomorrow. There will be more bread. Somewhere, laughter shook loose from a throat that hadn't remembered it owned the trick. He cut the feed before gratitude could dilute the instructions. He turned to Calix. Now we build the thing I didn't announce. A ward, Calix said, lenses narrowing. A net against whispers. Not a net, Lex said. He expanded the lattice again. Filaments anchored at 6 points around the hive drew into a shallow dome. A blindfold. Just enough dampening to make minor psychic interference lose its way, without tugging at whatever lighthouse your navigators love. A corridor for reason. Calix's hands hovered over the design as if warming themselves. The choir will hate it. They'll breathe longer, Lex said. In the cathedral, Drax watched the city's reaction bloom and curdle. The poor grasped the rope Lex had tossed and began to pull. The priests hissed a little and smiled a lot in public. Foremen fought their own habits and won, then lost, then won again. By afternoon, a pair of ecclesiarchal notaries requested an audience with her. Their papers accused Lex of replacing faith with compliance, and their eyes begged her to be the knife they needed. She dismissed them with the careful respect due to explosives and went looking for Lex herself. She found him beneath the tower, sleeves dark with someone else's oil, eyes bright as his gauntlet bled a thin glow into the dirt. You just told 1 billion souls that God is a checklist, she said. I told them that survival is, he answered without looking up. Your God can keep his portfolio. You know nothing of his portfolio, she said, and for the first time there was heat in it. The beacon that holds the swarms of hell back from our doors is not a myth scribbled on a ledger. It is a weight borne by a man who is more corpse than throne, and by the souls of the faithful. Nudge the frequencies too far, and the night eats the lanes our ships sail. His hands paused. He looked at her, not flippant, not cruel. Then give me the margins, he said quietly. Give me the tolerances. I won't break your beacon. I will make room beneath it where people can learn to stand. He meant it. She believed him enough to be terrified by the possibility that he could. Isola, she said, and the astropath stepped from the shadow like a candle choosing a draft. Her eyes were blind, milked by distances, and full of stars no one had mapped. Tell him what you hear. Isola's voice was a chord sung softly. When he speaks, the warp hisses. When he calculates, something old leans close, like an ear against a door. It is not a god. It is hunger that learned patience. If he threads his wires wrong, it will follow the signal. Lex listened without the armor he usually wore around words like hers. Then I will thread them right, he said, because he didn't have another move and he didn't know how not to make one. By evening, the spires inhaled and exhaled as promised. 3 breaths of dim, a flutter of unease, then steadiness. On a tenement roof, a boy counted aloud and laughed when his count matched the light's return. In a boiler room, a woman let the water run brown to the 3rd cough, then filled a basin that did not smell like a battlefield. In a market alley, 2 knives went back into belts because the bread cart arrived early, pushed by a man in a priest's half-robe and a worker's boots. Lex stood with Valen on a narrow balcony where the city spread like a circuit diagram alive with moving charges. Wind dragged the smell of hot metal and rain into a swirling compromise. I executed orders, Valen said after a long time, watching a column of children with new masks fan out to schools drawn in chalk on walls. Your orders. You executed sense, Lex said. Give it a chance. You could grow attached. Valen's mouth took the shape of something that might one day become a smile if left in the sun. I have seen attachments break battalions. Then attach to outcomes, not men, Lex said. Start with fewer funerals. Below, a small procession moved uncertainly down a stair street. A priest carrying a censer, a handful of acolytes, a woman with a broom who had not taken off her apron. They stopped beneath a spire and stared up as if considering whether to anoint it or ask it for hours. The priest raised his censer, lowered it, and settled for touching the spire's base with 2 fingers the way a man touches a new tool and tells himself it has always belonged. Drax arrived on the balcony with her coat unbuttoned at the throat, which meant she had run or wanted someone to think she had. Your speech has caught fire, she said. I will spend the night putting out the parts that try to burn the wrong things. Let them shout, Lex said. Then give them a broom and a valve schedule. She took a step closer, searching his face like a battlefield for weakness. You are not content with spires and pipes. I can feel you reaching past them. I'm building a corridor, he said, looking toward the line of the horizon where cloud met a darker dark. Not only through the air, but through fear. If we can dampen the small whispers, people can hear themselves. Maybe even hear you when you warn them about the big ones. The storm crawled over the east ridge like an animal testing a fence. Guardsmen on the line strapped themselves into firing nests that wouldn't matter against weather, and priests held up sensors that wouldn't change math. Lex sent telemetry to his visor and watched the turbulence sort itself into a pattern he would not call a face. It's tracking our dampening nodes, he said. Drax stood beside him under a tarped awning hammered to a parapet, rain stepping through the seams in neat, unbothered threads. So it hears you, she said. Or smells you. Choose the metaphor least offensive to you. It's following the easiest path through noise, Lex said. Good systems and bad predators do that in equal measure. He pinged Calyx. Spool the Aegis towers. Not full burn. I want a soft field wide spread. Calyx's reply came with static and a hiss of pain he didn't bother to edit out. Aegis arrays primed. Choir contamination minimized. If your numbers wobble, our throats will bleed. Noted, Lex said. He looked to Valen, who was already in motion, helmet sealed, squads fanning to anchor points along the wall with the inevitability of a falling hammer. If this escalates, I want civilians below the 4th tier moved away from the East Bay. The low streets flood if pressure spikes. Valen didn't argue. You're becoming very good at giving orders to people you don't own, he said, and disappeared into the storm with a squad moving like a single thought. Isola leaned her elbows on the stone. Blind eyes turned to the storm. Listen, she whispered, and Lex almost said he wouldn't, but then a thin keening slid under the rain. Not sound. The absence of it stretched tight. It plucked at his spine like a string. It's not just sniffing, Isola said. It's interested. Then we bore it, Lex said, because fear didn't help math and it never helped him. The first Aegis tower came alive with a tremor through the hive's bones. It did not blaze. It did not sing. It made a sound like a deep breath that made other sounds behave better. The storm's edge hesitated, wind fraying against a line it couldn't quite cross. 2 more towers joined, then the 4th. The pressure that had been pushing toward a point suddenly spread itself thin, as if disappointed. Civilians in rain-slick alleys didn't see towers or fields. They saw lantern flames hold steady and laundry lines stop thrashing themselves to death. A woman laughed out loud on a balcony and did not know why. "It's working," Calix said, awe and terror shivering on the same dial. "It's balancing," Lex corrected, because the difference mattered. They held it for an hour. The storm circled, prodded, retreated a little, returned. When it finally broke, it did so unevenly, like a hunter deciding the prey wasn't worth the sprint. The east ridge went soft. The guardsmen slumped. Valen didn't. "Do not relax," he voxed. Hale would not waste a distraction. Hale did not waste it. The first bomb was prayer-shaped. It came wrapped in linen stamped with saints and brass filigree, delivered on a litter as a gift for the spire that had made a district's water sweet. The acolyte carrying it cried with gratitude while his hands shook with a very different craft. The blast chewed outward along the geometry of the access hatch. If Lex hadn't changed the bracing a day earlier, the spire would have lost the bottom third of its ribs. The second bomb was a pamphlet, thin as a palm, printed on cheap pulp but glossed enough to feel important. It did not explode. It argued. "No saints, a doctrine of chains," the cover snarled, in letters tall enough to read across an alley. Inside, it explained, reasonably, persuasively, venomously, that standards were just new collars and that he who measures you owns you. It made points Lex would have made himself if he'd chosen to lie. "They're good," he admitted, flipping pages with an irritation that had nothing to do with mere insult. "They're using my tone." "You gave it to them," Drax said. She set the pamphlet on fire over a censer and watched it curl. "We burn 1,000 of these, and still 10,000 will find pockets. Then we bury them under better work," Lex said. "Calix, feed me fault reports in real time. We'll be at the breakages before the paper reaches them." They were quick, but the city's habit of believing bad news outran them by half a street. In the market quarter, men shouted that spires stole heat from shrines. In the Habs, a woman swore she'd seen a child's breath fog in summer because the Aegis towers drank souls. A priest on a box yelled until his voice failed that the Green Man's machines were a staircase into damnation and got off the box to help unload a cart of bread that arrived early because the Green Man's schedule had made it so. "And dim the lights while you argue over which saint signs the requisition," Drax said. The prelate's smile hardened a tooth. "No, it is not a request," he said, and reached too quickly for the hinge. Valen's hand moved faster. The knife met 2 fingers of ceramite and stopped. The prelate made a small noise. Drax took the case. She closed it with the gentleness she reserved for explosives and humiliations. "Stand down," she told the prelates, "or I will remind you on writ and by fire what jurisdiction means when ships start dying in the dark." They left with sanctimony steaming like sweat. The cathedral would not forget the bruise. Night came hungry for a target. It found Lex walking a scaffolding above the midhabs, listening to the city's hum, writing fixes in his head. The shot came from too far for a local rifle and too neat for a riot gun. His suit spat a warning and twisted his shoulder a centimeter. The round tucked itself into the air where his heart had planned to be and went whining off a strut. He rolled behind a coil housing and counted. The second round hit his visor guard and cracked it. Spiderwebs of stress lines crawling across the display like frost. He appreciated the shooter's professionalism even as he hated their aim. 200 meters, he voxed, already feeding Calix the narrowing angles. 3-story Habs stack with a slanted rain collector. "On it," Valen said, voice like a door slamming. A moment later, the night coughed bolter fire. Metal screamed, a body fell that wasn't alone. Drax arrived through a stairwell that hadn't been designed for coats and pistols. She knelt beside Lex and examined the cracked visor like a mother deciding whether a fever deserved a doctor. "They're escalating," she said. "They're paying attention," Lex said. He sealed the crack with a gel that hardened while he breathed shallow. So do we. They tracked the assassin to a workshop 3 alleys over, where pamphlets had been turned into wicks and charging coils into letters. The dead man had carried a purity seal on his chest and a map of Lex's routes in his pocket. On the wall, in grease and ash, someone had drawn the spire and a crown above it with the X through both. Not Hale, Valens said, towing the diagram with contempt. Too crude. Hale in spires, Lex said, scanning the workbench, his fingers adjusting pieces the way a chess player resets a table after a game he didn't like. He rarely instructs. A whisper of air turned into a servitor cherub, bumping its round skull against the window like a moth. It held a ribbon of paper in its tiny metal hands. Drax plucked it from soft pincers and unrolled it. No saints, only standards, it read. Meet me where standards are born. Factory 6, Calyx said, lenses sharpening. The calibration hall. Valen hated ambushes and loved ending them. He assembled a team in 8 sentences and no wasted gestures. They moved through the hive in echoing thuds and brief glints of light on ceramite. Drax went because she didn't allow other people to make her choices for her. Isola followed because songs like this grew louder if she stayed away. The calibration hall smelled like metal and old numbers. Machines ringed an empty floor painted with grid lines that had been prayed over until someone forgot what the lines were for. Hale stood at the center, hands open, blade sheathed, a figure half in shadow and half in the thin glow of emergency lamps. You keep your appointments, he said. I keep my promises, Lex said, stepping onto the grid. He'd left his visor cracked on purpose. Let the other man see the damage. Predators got bold around wounds, and bold was predictable. You promised them bread, Hale said, pity and scorn in equal measure. Then you promised them a ruler that fits inside their heads. It's elegant. It's monstrous. It's necessary, Lex said. For now, Hale agreed, and the respect in it made Valen's stance shift a degree toward the trigger. They'll owe you their definition of good. The worst empires are the ones that start with clean water. You prefer the ones that start with knives? Drax asked, voice cold enough to frost steel. I prefer the ones that end, Hale said, and then the floor hummed. Grid lines glowed. The hall wasn't a room. It was a device. Hale had brought them to stand inside a machine that measured truth and obedience in equal parts, and he'd rewritten it to accept neither. Lex moved first because he always did. He threw a frequency at the grid and it came back wrong on purpose, a lie a machine had learned to tell itself. He grinned despite himself. You're good. For now, Hale agreed, and the respect in it made Valen's stance shift a degree toward the trigger. They'll owe you their definition of good. The worst empires are the ones that start with clean water. You prefer the ones that start with knives? Drax asked, voice cold enough to frost steel. I prefer the ones that end, Hale said, and then the floor hummed. Grid lines glowed. The hall wasn't a room. It was a device. Hale had brought them to stand inside a machine that measured truth and obedience in equal parts, and he'd rewritten it to accept neither. Lex moved first because he always did. He threw a frequency at the grid and it came back wrong on purpose, a lie a machine had learned to tell itself. He grinned despite himself. You're good. I am honest, Hale said, and threw the first blade. Valen's Marines took the edges, bolters roaring. Hale danced the pattern he'd etched into the floor, stepping from square to square with a logic that bent bullets. Drax sighted, fired, corrected, fired again, her pistol stuttering discipline. Calyx reached for the grid with a cable and yelped when it bit him like a dog. Isola pressed her palm to the wall and breathed a warning the room pretended not to hear. Careful, there are doors under the paint. Lex didn't fight the room. He joined it. He let his suit lock to the subtle rise and fall beneath his boots and used that heartbeat to predict where the grid would lie next. He dragged tools into place with the magnets in the floor, tracing a counterpattern while Hale watched with the smile of a craftsman caught by another man's trick. Standards, Hale said, as if they were discussing poetry. What happens when you fail one? Do you punish? Adjust. Forgive. All 3, Lex said, and closed his counter loop. The grid shuddered. For a fraction of a second, the room remembered what it had been built to do. Bring a machine into true. Hale's pattern faltered. Valen's shot did not. It took Hale in the shoulder and spun him. Drax's second round shattered his blade. Calix's cable kissed the floor and this time didn't get bit. It injected a surge that wiped a lie from an old memory. Hale vanished into a vent he'd loosened with months of patience. He left blood and a laugh that sounded like respect and a promise. On the walk back, rain thickened. The hive lights held. The pamphlets still crinkled in pockets. The storm on the ridge had found another ridge. Drax walked beside Lex without speaking until they reached the cathedral's apron. She stopped there and fixed him with a look as heavy as a judgment. "You keep winning the argument," she said. "But the argument is turning into a war." "It was always a war," Lex said. "I'm just making it honest." "You're making it loud," she said. "And loud things are heard." Isola shivered, not from cold. "The big songs are learning the chorus," she whispered. Lex looked up at the spires, at the Aegis towers, at the lines he'd drawn through a city that had survived this long by refusing to learn new music. He felt something between pride and dread. He did not know which one he should feed. "Then we write a better song," he said, and in the distance, somewhere beyond star and storm, something that had been patient for millennia turned its head. Ink bled through 1,000 parchments and then through the arms of the men pressed beneath them. Ecclesiarchal writ burned into flesh to make sure no one mistook ceremony for suggestion. In market squares, on baroque walls, on the doors of habstacks, the same words appeared. The green stranger was named arch-heretic and architect of a false order. He was to be taken alive if possible, in pieces if necessary. Bells rang not in praise but in alignment, their tones braided into a schedule older than reason. Lex read one of the decrees as it smoked on a door and reached out to touch the ash with 2 fingers. It smeared. He didn't smile. "They finally found a word big enough," he said, and the air answered with an impact that shook dust loose from old saints. The first assassins wore faith instead of armor. They slipped through corridors that had been designed to make sound kneel, not carry it. One knelt in a shadow and pushed a needle through a gap in Calix's gear. The needle hit a plate that hadn't existed yesterday because Lex had refused to wait for permission to install it. The second swung a chain of beads that ended in a monomolecular wire. Valen caught it in a gauntlet and twisted until bones warned the hand's owner about permanence. The third had a voice trained to command machines by singing their catalog numbers. She made a cogitator open like an eye and then felt her throat tighten when the machine ignored her for the first time in its life. Calix still took a blade for Lex. Sighed, deep, ugly, the sort of wound that made mechadendrites flutter like frightened birds. He rocked, hissed, and hammered his own chest twice with a steel fist to remind his body who ran it. "We maintain," he snarled and bled without asking permission. "Your name is in their mouths," Drax said as she stepped over a fallen assassin and wiped her pistol on the man's robe with no reverence at all. "And in their prayers. The latter is worse." "Prayers don't carry bullets," Lex said, and looked down at the blood on Calix's robes. "Move," he told the med-servitor. The machine trundled. He pressed a seal over the wound that glowed a precise green as it fused meat and mesh. "You're not allowed to die. I'm still using you." "Noted," Calix managed, the word half-laugh and half-error code. Orders came for Valen like stones slamming into a shield. "Seize the heretic. Deliver him to cathedral custody. Do not fail." Valen stood with the Vox trembling at his throat and watched Lex with the same narrow-eyed focus he gave an enemy war machine. Duty weighed his spine. The city weighed the other side. "Captain," Drax said softly, as if not to crack anything that could still hold, "the writ carries the seal. If you refuse, you answer to a court that hammers with plasma." Valen's jaw worked once, a muscle not tightening and easing. He turned to Lex. "You will come into custody under my care. You will not resist." Lex considered the geometry of the room, the outs, the angles, and set every exit aside. "I have a better idea," he said, and walked past both of them to a panel he had insisted on building into the wall when he'd wired the first spire. He put his palm against it. The hive took a breath, then another, then held it. Doors locked in a sequence that made the city a puzzle box. Lifts froze at odd floors. Gates reprogrammed themselves to be impossible for anyone without a certain arithmetic in their fingers. What did you just do? Drax's voice flattening meant she had already guessed. I taught the city to obey an emergency protocol called Stop the Idiots, Lex said. It closes routes the cathedral favors and opens corridors to hospitals and food depots. It's not a prison. It's a map with more sense. You just put a leash on a hive, Valen said. I gave it a spine, Lex corrected. Arrest me later. Right now, your priests are going to try a coup, and I intend to make them walk. The first wave hit at dusk, because legends prefer torches. Faithful guardsmen in flak and hope surged up the stair streets with banners snapped hard by wind. Priests marched behind them with censers left unlit because smoke red as fear. The people on the balconies didn't cheer. They watched the way a body watches a knife being taken out of a drawer. Valen's squads held intersections. Not with zeal, but with habit he trusted more. Drax positioned kill zones where they would hurt morale least and help truths most. Lex stood on a gantry with a portable console embedded in his forearm and counted the ways a city could be taken apart by men convinced they were saving it. Bring the Aegis up to 20%, he told Calix. I want psychers drunk, not dead. A blasphemy in two directions, Calix said, but his hands moved. The towers woke. They did not flare. They bled a pressure into the world like a heavier gravity. Wild whispers flinched and drowned. Back-alley sorcerers found their knuckles hurting where their tricks used to start. Choirs steadied. In the front ranks of the assault, white-eyed zealots who had planned to burst into glorious flame instead wobbled and vomited while their hands shook around knives they could suddenly see. It saved lives. It enraged the wrong men. A gnashing vehicle with a shrine for a forehead and a cannon for a mouth ground up a boulevard and belched a shell through a tenement's top floor. The people who lived there were already on the stairs because Lex had warned them the week before that if war came, walls would not love them. He pinged Valen a path. Valen used it and took the machine apart from the blind side with 3 shots and an oath. The cathedral retaliated with words sharp enough to cut air. All voxes blared a new decree. The towers were heretical engines, their dampening proof of a plot to dim the Godemperor's holy beacon. They demanded the tower's surrender and promised a pardon that would leave the skin but not the soul. Their voices carried power even when their arguments didn't. Lex flipped his own switch. If you can hear me, he told the city, and you're alive, you're doing it right. Keep your heads down. Pass water. Wrap the old around the small. If someone tells you to pray a machine into obedience, throw them out of the room. If someone throws you bread and asks for nothing, take it and give them a job tomorrow. His rules traveled alley to alley, elbow to elbow, as hands carried bodies and buckets. Women whose eyes had seen too many kinds of fire slapped priests who reached for controls with holy fingers and said, "Not today." Children with the new masks ran messages along routes Lex had cleared and felt important for the first time, which was not holy and felt like it anyway. The second wave came with armored pennants. Cathedral shock troops in ornate plate advanced behind portable altars that made his instruments misbehave. The Aegis towers pushed back. The field thickened around each altar and turned their sanctified pressure into ordinary air. Guns became arguments. Arguments bent to geometry. At the spire's base, Valen found himself face to face with a man he'd trained with decades ago. A sergeant with a scar like a second mouth and eyes that wanted orders to be simple. Stand aside, the sergeant said. This is doctrine. Valen's voice rarely grew. It did not now. This is Kespera, he said. And it's mine to protect. They fought because the system demanded that motion. Valen pulled his blows when he could. Others did not. Blood patterned the stairs in the old designs war always favors. Drax moved along a catwalk with her pistol low and her mind high and counted casualties like beads, each one a prayer she refused to say. She did not let herself look at Lex until the hour grew thin and the city had achieved that strange state-fought places reach where motion becomes the only stable thing. Your towers are singing into something beyond the city, she told him without preface. Hands braced on a rail as if she could push back meteors. Isola says the harmonics are licking the edge of the beacon's field. If you keep pushing, you could make navigators cough blood on ships you will never see. Then this isn't a siege. It's a funeral flotilla. Lex stared at the map in his visor. It showed the city as a breathing lattice, and beyond it something vast and dark with one burning point in the middle. He knew the point without knowing it. The Astronomicon, the lighthouse by which this empire pretended to be one thing. He imagined 1 billion souls pouring themselves into a hole until the whole thought it was a sun. "I'm not trying to dim your God," he said. "I'm trying to put a shade over a candle in a wind, in one room, so the family can eat without ash in the soup." "The shade still throws a shadow," she said, and if there had been time she would have gentled the words. There was no time. A tower shuddered as a demolition charge went off at its base and 100 voices yelled "No" in 10 dialects. Valen's vox cracked with shouted ranges and bearings. Calix's breath hitched as a console bit him and he bit it back. "Give me numbers," Lex said, and she did. Tolerances, frequencies, the difference between disaster and balance expressed in decimals he could hold. He tuned the Aegis towers down by fractions that would have seemed petty in any other universe and watched the field narrow and firm. The big burning point sighed. The storm along the east ridge found something else to be. Below them, Vorn Hale chose his own theater. He led a needle-thin team along a maintenance spine he would have designed himself if he had owned the contract. His men wore parts catalogs on their belts instead of relics. They moved like the solution to a problem the cathedral had not decided existed yet. Their target was not a tower. It was the relay that tied the blindfold together. Lex saw the ripple too late because doing 3 miracles at once with a machine that did not want them all was still just one brain. Valen felt it in the way the floor under his boots lost confidence for a heartbeat. Drax felt it in her gut, the organ that listened to wars, and Isola felt it with her whole body as the big song shifted a note she could not afford to hear. "North Relay," Calix gasped, fingers dancing. They cut the trunk. Lex ran. He did not run like a hero with a flag. He ran like an engineer late for a failure. Stairs blurred. Rooms opened into other rooms because walls meant less to men like him when urgency wrote the rules. Valen stormed down a parallel corridor like a storm deciding where to break. Drax moved on a vector that intersected both of them and refused to admit that fate had anything to do with it. Hale was already at the panel when Lex came around the last corner. The arch-heretic had bled through a bandage that had not asked for permission to be part of him, and he looked badly and beautifully alive. "You're a symphony I wasn't prepared for," Hale said without turning. "It makes this almost a pity." "Almost," Lex agreed and hit him. No grace. No speech. A man built to argue with gods and markets lowered his shoulder and drove another man into a wall for the sin of being good at the wrong time. They crashed through a table that had spent a century holding ledgers of sacred voltage. Hale bit Lex's ear through composite. Lex drove a knee into Hale's ribs and heard something important complain. Valen smashed through a door and kept going through the man who tried to stop him. Drax shot a fuse from Hale's hand without shooting the hand because she needed it for questions later. Calix jammed a cable into a socket and burned out a sacrament he hadn't believed in since morning. The relay lived. The blindfold held. The Aegis towers hummed at a pitch that didn't make Isola bleed. The storm moved on with the boredom of a god denied worship. They bound Hale to a rail with a chain meant for dangerous cargo and ideas, stuttering prayers because the men present only knew 2 languages for emergency, and both had words for tying dangerous things down. Hale smiled through blood. "Standards," he rasped at Lex, as if the word itself were the knife he'd brought. "What happens when you fail yours?" Lex wiped his mouth and tasted copper and machine oil and anger. "We fixed the thing that failed," he said. He didn't look at Drax when he added, "Even if it's me." The city did not cheer. It kept breathing. Fires punched out. Water ran a little muddier and then a little cleaner. The hive's bells remembered their original job and counted hours instead of martyrs. In tenements, people slept with one boot on because habits outlast victories. Dawn came pale and thin, and Lex stood on a platform with his hands on a rail that was warm from too many hands. The Aegis towers purred a compromise with a lighthouse a galaxy away. Valen posted guards not to keep the people out, but to keep the wrong people from telling the right people what their day looked like. Drax signed a paper that made her the most hated woman in the cathedral for a week and the most necessary for longer. Isola sat with a blanket and drank tea and tried not to hear a song that had learned new words. Lex watched the city hold and knew the bill was coming. He did not yet know its currency. He suspected it would be human. The hour after dawn tasted like old coins. Men hosed soot from steps that had learned to drink blood. The Aegis towers purred low, content for the moment. Hale hung from the rail where they'd chained him, pale under grime, eyes bright with a craftsman's curiosity for his own failure. Calix checked the relay again and again until his hands moved without orders. Valen rotated squads like clock teeth. Drax signed 2 orders and tore up 3. Isola sat with a cup gone cold and flinched at songs no one else could hear. The first message came as a pressure, not a sound, and made every candle in the cathedral lean the same way. Drax's vox clicked, failed, recovered, and delivered a code that moved her mouth into a line that would cut a finger if you ran it there. Sector Choir reports harmonic drift, she said, to the room and to herself. A dozen world's navigators listing like drunk sailors. They traced the distortion to us. Calix's lenses narrowed. Our blindfold. Our corridor, Drax said. She looked at Lex as if he were both key and bomb. If we do nothing, ships die hours from now. If we smash the Aegis, the city listens to the warp again and we lose this by nightfall. Either way, I will be the woman who chose the wrong funeral. Lex's visor showed him lines no one else could see, threads humming from Kespera toward a point far beyond the roofs. The beacon was not on his map, but its pull was. He felt the numbers like a hand around his ribs. Where's your tether to the bigger light? He asked. Not the choir that prays messages. The thing that keeps ships from guessing. Drax's silence was permission and a sin. She led them through doors that had been locked since before any living parishioner had been born, then downstairs cut by machines that had been taught to pray while they bit stone. The air grew colder, then warmer in a way that had nothing to do with heat. The halls widened into a chamber that had learned to be a cathedral long before the cathedral learned to be a hall. The thing at its center was an altar if you needed the word, a relay if you trusted function. Ribs of ancient metal curving into a half-crown, cables drooping like roots into a pool of black glass. Cherub servitors circled with dead eyes and live knives. Every surface had been written on by 1,000 hands that had never met and still knew how to spell the same fear. To one side, a choir of pale men and women lay strapped into couches, minds already half-turned to the place where navigation steals certainty from madness. Isola stopped at the threshold. Don't ask me to sing, she whispered. Just give me the pitch so I can know when you miss it. Hale laughed through cracked lips in the back of the hall. They had dragged him here because moving him anywhere else felt like giving him a choice. You're going to tune a god with a wrench, he said, admiring and appalled. You really are from somewhere else. Lex approached the crown. The armor around his chest tightened in a reflex he didn't own. He looked back at Drax. If I ask for your jurisdiction in writing, do I have to wait for the ink to dry? You have my word, she said. And my pistol if you fail. Comforting, he said, and put his hands into history. It was not electricity. It was not software. It was not any one thing he had ever bent to his will. It was a braid. Machine, flesh, belief, necessity, all twisted tighter and tighter until it sang because there was no other sound it could make and still be itself. His suit's dampeners engaged on their own, then failed in a way that didn't look like failure. The numbers on his visor dissolved into symbols older than numbers and then recomposed as if embarrassed to be seen naked. He breathed and matched the relay's rhythm with the only religion he trusted. Count, measure, adjust. He opened his palm. Green hex plates extended into petals and hovered over the black glass. He pulsed a gentle anti-harmonic, barely enough to nudge dust. The world remembered it was hung from something not designed to carry weight forever. Isola made a noise that would have been a scream if she had air to waste. Calix coughed blood onto his sleeve and didn't notice. Valen's hand found a rail and crushed it quieter. Drax's eyes closed because she would not look away, but she could choose how many senses she sacrificed. Lex saw it. Not with eyes. With the pieces of himself he had sharpened for decades and never named. The beacon was not a lamp. It was a wound they kept open on purpose. A current of souls poured through a man who had once been a word and was now a verb. It pushed back the ocean not by hating it but by refusing to be swallowed. A million lives burned like candles, not once but always, their heat braided into a rope thrown across the dark. He measured the strain as if the dark would be polite enough to let him reduce it. "Margins," he whispered. "Give me your margins." It hurt. Not his body, which adapted to pain like a negotiator adapts to price. The part that believed that math could save anyone without stealing from someone else screamed and did not stop. He tuned anyway, not away from the beacon's note but around it, carving a thin corridor through the pressure, a place where whispers would snag and die and other, larger songs would not even notice the change. The relay pushed back. It wanted to be what it had been carved to be. Lex did not argue. He offered it a better way to do its job and not devour the floorboards where people ate. He trimmed his Aegis fields by decimals that made Calyx mutter numbers like prayers and made Isola's nails bite her palms and draw blood she did not feel. Upstairs, the city shivered and settled. Far beyond, in black between stars, a ship that had been sliding sideways found its keel and did not ask why. A navigator who had been bleeding from the eyes blinked salt and laughed like a child. Somewhere else, a different ship that should have died waited one more minute and did not. In the chamber, alarms flowered in red along the balcony. The cathedral had found their locked doors and brought a cutting torch called jurisdiction. Zealots pushed through with relic shields and voices trained to turn doubt into an order. "Stand aside," one roared, seeing Lex's hands in the machine. "He blasphemes." Valen moved to meet them with the efficiency of a man who had always known this was the day his old life would ask for his head. Bolters barked. The relic shield sang when rounds hit it and changed the notes into something that might have been a hymn if you believed in the right way. Drax fired only when she had to. The rest of the time she used her breath to swear in 3 languages appropriate to courts she would never see. Hale twisted against his chain like an idea trying to get out of a skull. "Your standards," he called over the chart of violence. "Fail them and you choose between 2 gods, yours and theirs." "I choose outcomes," Lex said, and then the relay bit him and he bit back. He made the last adjustment with a motion that looked like mercy and was closer to theft. He stole slack from systems that had hoarded it and gave it to the ones that never had enough. The crown's hum slid a fraction north on a scale only machines and saints were supposed to hear. Isola exhaled a note that sounded like surviving. The candles straightened. The pool of black glass forgot for a heartbeat that it wanted to be a window and decided it liked being water after all. The zealots at the door felt their shields grow heavy and their anger become work. Valen drove them back in a rhythm that matched the new tone in the room. Drax kneed a man in the thigh hard enough to teach him anatomy and then took his knife because it was better than his faith. Calyx slammed a palm into a console and locked a circuit in place with a word that might have been please but was probably a checksum. Lex pulled his hands free. The armor around his chest hissed closed with relief. For a breath, he stood with his eyes unfocused, face pale beneath the green's reflection, as if the room had taken something and he had not yet decided if he wanted it back. Isola touched his forearm, delicate as a moth landing. "It heard you," she said. "It didn't like you. But it heard you." He nodded once, the gesture of a man who had just shaken hands with a mountain and pretended it had been a fair meeting. "We've got a corridor," he said, voice hoarse. "You can breathe. Ships can see. The big light doesn't care about our little hat." "Hat," Calyx repeated weakly, and then laughed until it turned into a cough. Drax looked from Lex to the relay to the men bleeding on her floor. She holstered her pistol. "If you had been wrong," she said, not softly, "we would all be ghosts arguing about it." "If I had been wrong," Lex said, "you wouldn't have to argue." Hale sagged against his chain, sweat cold on his skin, eyes never leaving the machine. "You threaded it," he said, equal parts admiration and disgust. "You made a space for your empire under theirs." "I made a space to think," Lex said. Footsteps pounded on the stair that hadn't been cut for running. A young guardsman slid into the room with breath like knives. "Message from outer pickets," he gasped. The storm broke. Like it tripped over something and decided it was bored. "Good," Valen said. "Not entirely. the guardsman added, swallowing. Something else is moving. Not storm. People. Pilgrims. Thousands. Marching for the cathedral. They say the heretic has touched the saint's heart and they're here to see justice done. Drax's mouth twisted. Of course, she said. The bill. Lex leaned on the rail with both hands and let the tremor in them stop being a secret. He looked up into the iron ribs of the room and saw a city he hadn't built pressing down with expectation, fear, gratitude, hate. All the currencies he had ever known how to spend and never wanted to owe. We go up, he said. We keep the corridor gentle. We keep the towers humming. We move food before we move guns. We cut the pamphlets off at the press. We don't shoot pilgrims. Some will shoot us, Valen said. Then we break their rifles and give them bread and make them tired, Lex said. Hail. The arch-heretic tilted his head, curious. Yes. I'm not killing you today, Lex said. I want you conscious when you decide whether to build better or die clever. Hale considered that, wincing as his shoulder complained. Standards, he murmured again. You keep saying the word like it will keep you warm. It will if everyone has one, Lex said. They climbed. The relay room closed behind them with a sigh too old for dates. In the nave, petitioners had already begun to pool. Men with hands rough from work, women with tired pride set into their mouths, children holding candles they were not sure they were allowed to like anymore. The rumor that the Green Man had put his hands in the cathedral's heart moved from lip to lip like a cup at a feast. On the cathedral steps, Drax faced a delegation of prelates who had prepared speeches for the old war and now found new weapons aimed at their metaphors. Valen arranged squads where they could be seen doing nothing and be feared for it anyway. Calix sat on a crate and let a servitor tie a bandage worse than the wound. Isola leaned against a pillar and breathed to the rhythm of a song that had agreed, for now, not to devour her. Lex stood where everyone could see him and no one could touch him without deciding to commit. He met eyes. He met more eyes. He did not bow. He did not smile. A woman in a baker's apron pushed forward until she could tilt her chin at him without shouting. My lights didn't flicker, she said. My water ran. My boy came home from the factory with all his fingers. Are you the reason? Yes, he said. A priest on his left hissed. A pilgrim on his right whispered a prayer that sounded suspiciously like a checklist. The crowd breathed in. And if the sky eats our ships because of your towers? Someone else shouted. The sky won't, Lex said, voice steady, because he'd just shaken hands with the mountain and didn't intend to look like he'd lost. I tuned them. Ask your navigators when they stop bleeding. Silence moved through the square like a thought making up its mind. Drax stepped to his shoulder where the whole city could see their angles overlap. He is not absolved, she said, each word nailed to the stone. He is not sanctified. He is not your saint. He is under my hand. And under it, he will keep building what keeps you alive, until he can't or until I say stop. It was not mercy and it was not a threat. It was a scaffold strong enough for a city to stand on while it argued with itself. Valen's vox rattled. Pilgrims at the outer stairs. Came the warning from a sergeant who had been a boy who had been a hungry child once in this same hive. They're singing. Keep them singing, Valen said. He turned his head to Lex. You've made many things today. Try to make that enough. Lex nodded, and for the first time since the relay he let himself look tired. He looked up at the spires, at the towers, at the long stair where a new storm was coming on 2 legs at a time, and thought of margins and weights and standards and the narrowest corridor he had ever carved where fear and faith and reason could walk in single file without shoving each other into the dark. We'll hold, he said, to Drax, to Valen, to Calix and Isola, to the city, to the room under the cathedral and the light beyond worlds, and, if he was honest, to himself. Then we'll see who wants the world to make sense, and who only wanted to win. They filled the lower steps shoulder to shoulder, eyes upturned, candles trembling in the drafts that blew through the ribs of the cathedral like breath in a sleeping giant. Pilgrims had walked through the night, bare feet black with soot, clutching relics made of brass and memory. They sang because that was what they knew to do when a story came to a knife's edge. The hymn braided hope to anger until the two were hard to tell apart. Valen placed his squads where armor could look like restraint. The Marines stood visible and still, a warning shaped like patience. Drax spoke to captains and steeplemasters and bread-kiln matriarchs. Her orders crisp and spare, no word wasted. Calyx hunched near a junction box with bandaged side and calm hands, turning a city back into a machine every time panic tried to make it a battlefield. Isola leaned against a pillar and counted breaths the way navigators count the moments between losing themselves. Lex stepped forward until he felt a million eyes, then one more, something vast and unblinking above the roof and beyond the sky. He lifted his palm. No flourish. No prayer. The candles in the square steadied as the Aegis towers hummed at the pitch he had coaxed them to hold. "I'm the man who broke your schedule and fixed your water," he said, voice traveling through the Vox with ruthless honesty. "I am not your saint. I am not your doom. I'm the reason your light didn't flicker when the storm came looking, and the reason you can hate me in the morning with a roof still over your head. Keep your candles. Keep your songs. Keep your children's fingers. I'll keep the machines true." A boy at the front, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and rain, lifted a relic that had been his grandfather's, a tiny brass box wound with a key. He turned the key and the box played 4 notes and jammed. He looked at the box, then at Lex, as if any answer worth having could be carried in one hand. "Hold it up," Lex said, and the boy obeyed. "Remember what those 4 notes were." The boy whistled them through a gap in his teeth. Lex pulsed the Aegis across the square, not with power but with alignment. The brass box shivered, clicked, and found the missing 5th note on its own. The boy grinned, a small miracle fitted into a cheap song. The cheer would have risen if cheers were not the kind of permission someone had come to steal. Near the middle ranks, a man in a pilgrim's cloak lifted a reliquary wrapped in old linen, his knuckles white. The cloth twitched as if something beneath it were trying to learn the word for out. Isola's head jerked. Drax's hand was already moving. Valen, too far to shoot without making a riot, took a step that broke a stare. "Don't," Lex said, and the word hit the air like a hand on a hot pan. The man hesitated for the length of a breath, the reliquary's corners pressing against the fabric like teeth. He had been told that justice needed spectacle, that faith demanded proof it had teeth as well as hymns. He had been told many things by a voice that sounded like his own conscience and a pamphlet that fit perfectly into his pocket. He had walked all night to be important for 5 seconds and the universe had noticed. Isola touched the stone with her palm and sang one note too low to hear. It went into the reliquary like water into a cracked cup. The cloth slackened a fraction. The man blinked as if waking into the wrong morning. Valen reached him like a storm taught to be gentle, one armored hand wrapping the reliquary, the other closing over the man's wrist with a compassion so heavy it bent the joint toward surrender. "Set it down," Valen said, and the soldier's voice had the weariness of a priest's last sermon after a long winter. The man's fingers opened. The reliquary kissed the stone and remembered it was a box. Hale laughed once from where he stood in chains under the arch with 2 Marines and a med-servitor for company. "Even your restraint is an engine," he said to Lex, softly enough that only guilt and ambition could hear it. Drax stepped into the air between Lex and the crowd. She held up a brand no wider than a thumb, a disc of iron engraved with the inquisitorial eye. It glowed with the heat of 100 hard choices. Her voice carried the way truth does when it knows it will make enemies. "Hear me," she said. "I am Inquisitor Seraphine Drax, hand and blade of the throne. This man is not absolved. He is not sanctified. He is not yours to carve into a story you prefer. He is sanctioned, conditionally, for the survival of Kespera. He answers to me. He will keep the towers tuned and the water clean. He will not preach. He will not rule. He will be measured, and if he fails the measure, I will end him." She pressed the brand to the green plate of Lex's pauldron. Iron-kissed composite and cut a small circle of black into gloss. The hiss was brief and ordinary. It marked nothing holy. The crowd exhaled as one animal with too many names. In the press of bodies, a ripple moved that wasn't panic. It was arithmetic. A woman tugged her daughter's hand toward the intake vents that needed scrubbing, reminded by the speech to find a brush. A foreman who had come to argue remembered a valve that had been seizing and made a note to sand it. A priest's lips tightened around a prayer and then, reluctantly, around a schedule. The pilgrim who had nearly made himself a weapon sat down on a step and started to cry because important had not felt the way he thought it would. Lex turned slightly, the new brand cooling on his shoulder, and looked past the square, past the spires, to where the Aegis Tower's hum braided with the relay's deeper tone. The corridor he had carved through pressure and dogma held. He felt its tension like a wire under his thumb. He would live on that wire until it broke or he did. Calyx limped up to him, eyes bloodshot within their lenses, mouth a sharp line that threatened to turn into something like pride. "We held tolerances," he said, which was a prayer in their language. "Keep the tolerances small," Lex answered. "If the math gets loud, the wrong things listen." Hale, overhearing, let his head thump back against the chain. "You've won yourself a city and a leash," he said. "You'll tire of both." "I'll replace both," Lex said, not as a taunt but as a plan set out on a table. "Build with me, Vorn. The cathedral will never trust you. I might if you give me better work than arguments." Hale's eyes glittered, pain making him present. "You offer absolution in the shape of a blueprint," he murmured. "Blasphemy, I understand." He didn't nod. He didn't refuse. He filed the sentence in the drawer where dangerous hopes go to sleep. The pilgrim's songs softened into work noise. Drax dismissed the prelates with a paper that cut them on the way back to their pulpits. Valen rotated squads off the line and into kitchens because a soldier who feeds civilians can't be lied about as easily. Isola found a bench and let the corridor's tone hum through her teeth until the ache in her skull receded to something a person could share space with. Afternoon wore itself thin and frayed into evening. The city's lamps came on in one steady inhale. Bread arrived early in 3 districts and on time in the 4th. No one stabbed anyone else in line. A boy took apart his brass music box, cleaned the grit from the gears with a toothbrush, and put it back together with the care of an apprentice to a grateful god. On the cathedral's upper balcony, the light from the spires painted Lex's armor in patient green. Drax stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder because distance would only create positions neither of them wanted to commit to. Below, Kespera looked almost rational if you squinted hard enough to blur the saints. "You still intend to change more than pipes," she said. "Yes," he said. "You will fail," she said, not unkindly. "Frequently," he agreed. "We'll fix what breaks." "And when the thing that fails is a person?" she asked, eyes still on the city. "Same answer," he said, and meant it until he would be forced not to. Valen joined them, helmet maglocked to his hip, gaze on the long stair where the last of the pilgrims were turning into neighbors again. "There will be other storms," he said. "Good," Lex said. "I build better under pressure." Valen's mouth made that almost smile again, the one that needed time and a quiet day to become real. "You'll hate the quiet days." "I don't believe in them," Lex said. An aide hurried up with a slate and the posture of a man about to hand a general a new war. Drax took it, scanned, and passed it to Lex. A chart of supply traffic from the rim flickered clean. A message from a navigator pilot rendered in courtesy and shock. The drift had eased, the light was steady. There were rumors in the void of an inquisitor with a heretic on a leash and a city that could sleep. Third line. An anomaly at the very edge of the corridor, a place where the big song had leaned in and then, inexplicably, leaned back. No explanation. No comfort. "It hurt us," Isola said later, when only the 4 of them remained on the balcony and the night was honest enough to stop pretending to be anything but dark. "It isn't curious. It is patient. It will not forget the taste." "Then we do not let the city taste like fear," Lex said. Drax tipped her face up into the soot-scrubbed sky as if considering whether to address a throne or a wound. "You are sanctioned," she said, "by my writ. It protects you from everything except me." "Fair," he said. "Don't make me use it," she said. He didn't promise. He couldn't. He settled for the only vow he would keep because he would build it himself. "Tomorrow, we start transit. Then food that doesn't learn our names. Then schools that teach more than obedience. Standards posted on every wall. I want a city that can fire me." That last part is why you frighten me more than the rest, Drac said, and the confession softened nothing. Below, Hale coughed and stared at the pattern of bolts in the stone as if memorizing a map. Calix fell asleep sitting up, a servo-skull hovering like a nervous pet. Valen took first watch without being asked, because some roles choose you and are kind enough not to lie about it. Lex looked past the hive to the thin glitter of orbital traffic and farther to the darkness he had threaded for an afternoon. Somewhere in that dark, a dead man on a throne burned like a star because others fed him their names. Somewhere else, a thought that had never been human turned its head and decided to wait. He pictured a map with two empires drawn on it, one made of faith and fire, the other of math and hunger. He pictured a third line stamped between them. Corridors, cities, standards. We'll share the galaxy, he said to the air, to the weight, to the people who would make the promise true or break it. Until you can't. The towers breathed. The relay purred. The city slept as well as any city that had learned to watch its own machines. Dawn would come without a sunrise again, and a million hands would rise with it, and work would happen because someone had the arrogance to draw lines in the dark and call them roads.